Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Merci
Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for
pour cette deuxième
being
journée
here
et
for
dernière
this
journée.
second
On se
and
retrouve pour
final
parler
day.
de RSE. Comment
To talk
concilier
about
le développement de la
CSR,
filière et
how to
l'intérêt
consider
général.
development
On va
of the
parler
sector
RSE
and
dans
general
les
interest.
énergies
We're
renouvelables.
going to be talking
On
about
le sait,
CSR
la
in
transition
renewables.
énergétique
We know
s'accompagne
that
de
the
nombreux
energy
défis,
transition
notamment
comes along with many
les enjeux
challenges,
sociaux
and in
et
particular that
environnementaux
of
au cœur des stratégies des
integrating
entreprises
social
des
challenges
énergies
within the
renouvelables. Alors,
heart
cette
of
table ronde
the
va
company's
explorer comment
strategies.
la RSE
So
peut
we will be
devenir
exploring
un levier
how
puissant
CSR
pour
can become
répondre à ces
an
attentes,
important lever
tout en
to
renforçant l'attractivité et
meet these
l'acceptabilité
challenges
des
whilst
projets. On en
consolidating
parle
the
avec
attractiveness of
nos
the
intervenants. Je les
project.
remercie toutes
We
les
will be
quatre
talking with our
d'être
speakers. I would like
présentes
to thank all
aujourd'hui.
four of them for
Nous
being with
rejoint
us
une
today.
experte des questions
We have an expert
RSE.
on the
On
questions
accueille
of
Myriam
CSR, Myriam BEAUPIED,
fondatrice, consultante,
founder,
stratégie,
consultant on
cabinet Gaïana,
CSR strategy
nous
and
expliquera
climate
pourquoi
from the
les
Gaïana
entreprises des ENR
practice,
doivent
and
adopter
he will
une
be
démarche
explaining
RSE
why
ambitieuse
renewable
et
companies
partager
must
aussi des
adopt an
exemples
ambitious
concrets de
CSR
pratique.
policy, and she
Et
will
la
be
RSE,
sharing
c'est son
best
métier.
practices.
Nous rejoint Merle PIEST.
And then we have
Merci
Merle
d'être avec nous, chef
PIEST.
de projet
Thank you for
risque
being with us. She's a
ENERGIE
risk
et
project
Regeneration de
manager,
AMARENCO. Je vous en prie, asseyez-vous.
GSC
AMARENCO
and
qui entend aller au-delà de
Regeneration,
l'approche de durabilité
which intends
pour
to
devenir une
go
entreprise
beyond the
régénérative.
approach
C'est le
of
terme que vous employez. Vous nous direz en
sustainability.
quoi cela consiste.
And
Avec notre
we will look at
prochain
what that
invité, on
consists in.
abordera
With our
l'importance
next guest,
d'intégrer
we
une
will look at the
dimension
importance
solidaire
of
dans la
integrating a
RSE
solidarity
des
approach within
Notre intervenante
CSR,
nous invite à lutter contre la précarité
and in
énergétique.
particular to
On
fight
accueille
against
Aurélie
energy
LEREBOURG,
vulnerability.
déléguée
And for
générale
this, we will
de
welcome
ENERGIE
Aurélie
solidaire.
LEREBOURG, a general delegate for
Et enfin, notre
energy
dernier invité nous
solidarity.
présentera le concept
And our last
dividende
guest
climat,
will present the
un
concept
outil,
of
vous allez le
climate
voir,
dividends,
novateur pour quantifier
a
et
new
valoriser
tool
la
to
contribution
quantify
des entreprises
and
à la
valorize
transition
the contribution of
énergétique.
companies
On
to
accueille
the
Laura
energy
Beaulier,
transition.
directrice
And
de
this is
l'association
Laura Beaulier, director
Climate Dividends.
of the
Vous
Climate
insistez
Dividends
sur
Association.
l'importance d'une démarche
You
structurée
underline the
et
importance of a
transparente
structured
au-delà
and
de la simple
transparent process,
communication pour éviter le
above and
greenwashing et
beyond
donc
simple
pouvoir
communication to avoid
démontrer son
greenwashing and to demonstrate its
Et
impact.
vous allez le voir, hein, les dividendes climat peuvent
And
aider
you'll
les
see that
entreprises
climate
dans
dividends
cette
can
démarche
help
complètement
companies
associée
in
à
this
une politique
process
RSE. Alors,
combined
cette
with a
table ronde est
CSR
divisée en
policy.
trois parties. On va d'abord échanger
This roundtable
sur
will be
les
in three
enjeux
parts. As
et
well, we'll be
les
talking about the
opportunités
challenges
de la
and
RSE
opportunities
dans
of
les ENR.
CSR in
Puis on
renewables.
découvrira des pratiques
And then we will be
exemplaires
looking
avec
at
des
best
impacts
practices
mesurables. Et
with
enfin,
measurable
on verra si
impacts.
la RSE
And
peut
finally, we
être
will
ou
see
non un
whether
levier dans
CSR can or cannot be a
l'acceptabilité du projet.
lever in the
On pourrait bien
project
sûr échanger
acceptability.
avec nos intervenantes et intervenants.
You will then be able
Et on
to
va
speak with
commencer
our
tout de suite
speakers. So
avec
let's begin immediately
Myriam
with
BEAUPIED.
Myriam
Myriam,
BEAUPIED.
merci d'être là. Je rappelle
Myriam,
que vous
thank you
êtes
for being
fondatrice et
here. You are
consultante en
founder
stratégie RSE
and
et climat,
consultant
fondatrice
in
du cabinet
CSR Climate,
Gaïana.
founder of the Gaïana
Première
practice.
question toute simple.
A simple
Pourquoi
question
est-ce
to
qu'il est
begin.
finalement
Why
essentiel que
is it
les entreprises du
essential
secteur
for
des énergies renouvelables
companies in the sector of
s'intéressent à cette
renewable
question
energies to take
de la
an interest
RSE?
in the question of
Alors, il y a
CSR?
plusieurs raisons. La
Well, a
première,
number
on
of
va dire,
reasons.
déjà,
The
c'est un
first
devoir
is
d'exemplarité de la
that we
filière
must be
dans les énergies renouvelables. Ça fait partie des
set an
entreprises
example in the
qui
sector.
vont construire le monde de demain.
We
et qui
are
font
among
partie
the
du
companies
paysage
that
du
will
monde de
build
demain.
the future
Donc, il y a
of
quand
the
même un
world.
devoir
And we will be
d'exemplarité
part of the
très
future
fort au niveau de la
landscape. So we
filière et
must set an
d'envie,
example
surtout
in our
au niveau
sector.
d'un certain âge à vouloir aller
And, you know, at a certain age, we
au-delà
really want
du
to go
contexte
beyond to
réglementaire,
the
que ce soit
regulatory
environnemental ou
context,
sociétal, de
be it
vraiment créer un monde
environmental
meilleur
or
pour demain.
social, to create a better world for the future.
Ensuite, donc, du coup, il y a plusieurs axes. Il y a aussi un
So the
côté,
number of
du coup,
directions, so there is a
réglementaire,
regulatory side
où
of things,
effectivement, il y a l'axe du coup des
where
nouvelles réglementations au niveau de
there
l'Europe
is new European
poussent les
regulation
entreprises,
which
du
encourage
coup, à
companies to
avoir plus d'exemplarité et aller plus loin
really
sur
set
certains
an example
sujets,
and develop
dont, du coup,
certain
environnementaux et sociétaux. Donc, quand on parle de
approaches
réglementation, on
further.
parle,
So
par
we're
exemple, de la
talking about
CSRD.
regulation, for example, the
Typiquement,
CSRD.
voilà, ça fait partie
Typically,
des sujets
that
où,
is a part
là, il y a
of
plusieurs personnes dans la salle qui sont soumises
the subject. I know that a certain number of people in the room are subject to this regulation. It forces them to go further in environmental and social parts and on the questions of governance. So the mindset in renewables, so far as we do renewables, that's fine, that's enough, we do enough CSR, we're doing enough positive things for the planet, but with this type of regulation, it encourages people to go further. And then the financial stakeholders really push these subjects
via leur réglementation,
via regulation,
ils demandent aux entreprises
and they
dans
ask
lesquelles ils
companies in which they invest.
Pour la dette, du coup,
This is for the
d'aller plus loin
debt,
sur ces sujets,
to
de
develop
prouver
these
leur
subjects
impact,
further and to
de
prove
minimiser
their impact
l'impact qu'ils ont,
and
de
to
les
minimize the
identifier, de les
impact they have, to
mesurer, de les
identify
quantifier, de
them,
mettre en
measure
place
them,
des
quantify them,
stratégies,
implement
avec, du coup,
strategies
sur du moyen long terme.
in mid,
Donc,
long
voilà, c'est
term.
un petit peu tous ces
So
points-là
it's
qui font,
all of these
que
points
pour moi,
which
aujourd'hui, c'est
mean
un
that
petit peu
for me
l'avenir
today,
aussi de
it represents the future of renewable energies. In any case, it's one of the important
pour les
points
entreprises.
for
Oui,
companies.
Laura, c'est un point
Laura,
important,
it
le
is
dit à
an
l'instant
important
Myriam,
point,
parce qu'on
as
n'est pas
Myriam
dans
said,
de
because
la communication.
we're not in the world of communication when you work in CSR.
Enfin, en tout cas, on peut l'être.
Well, you can be,
idéalement, il faut pas
but
faire que ça.
ideally, you
Je
shouldn't
pense
be
que
just
le cas du
communicating.
secteur des
I
énergies
think the
renouvelables est
case of
assez
the renewable
emblématique parce que
energy
c'est un
sector is
secteur qui,
quite
par défaut,
emblematic because it is a
est
sector which,
plutôt
by
positif
default,
et
is
plutôt engagé dans la
positive
transition, et donc c'est
and
un endroit où
committed to
la
the
RSE a
transition.
peut-être
So it's
été
a
un
place
peu
where
finalement
CSR
le parent pauvre
was
parce qu'on
no
avait l'impression
doubt
qu'on n'avait pas
the poor
forcément besoin
parent
de
because we didn't
justifier, de
necessarily
valoriser parce
need
que
to
par défaut,
justify
ce qu'on
and
faisait,
value
c'était
this
bien.
because what we were doing everywhere else was good. So I think that we're at a turning point now. If we want it to be useful for this sector, it shouldn't just be communications because all you need to say is I work in renewable energies, it's great, but we need to make it a real tool for steering strategy, quantity and valorization. And I think that here there's a real opportunity for the sector. And now that things have been normalized, in addition to be a good actor of the transition, to be able to really stand apart, and if we keep CSR just in the field of communication, and I don't think that it's enough. But if we use very concrete things that act as bridges between selectivity and finances, and there are also many other levers and links that can be made in this way. So it is a structured process within the company that irrigates all of the departments. Yes, absolutely. I will have the opportunity maybe to talk about what we do with climate dividends, but typically when you have indicators, such as what we're doing, it's the number of tons of CO2 we've avoided. So it's good to make a video about it and put it in your booth in EnerGaïa, but it becomes far more interesting when it becomes a criteria according to which the teams are paid, team to obtain bank loans. And this is where we link this CSR approach with the heart of our business and strategy. And there's a real potential which can be very significant for the deployment of the company. So here you're putting the finger on the subject. It must be at the heart of the company's strategy. And in AMARENCO, the management is direct. The director of CSR answers directly to the boss of the company. Yes, for AMARENCO, it's the initiative of the CEO. So we are a regenerative company. And this is why our regeneration department is now called, it's very important within the company. And it also means that currently our regeneration director answers directly to our executive board. So it means that she has a far more important role to play. And it's not just communication. Before she was connected to communications, human resources, but now regeneration is entirely part of the company's strategy. So we talked a lot about regeneration. And it's often had some negative feedback because it's now kind of overused by companies. But what does regeneration mean? Because we talk about it, but nobody ever really puts a definition behind it. And even AFNOR has recently published a new specification to explain what regeneration actually is. So beforehand, we had social responsibility of the company, which also takes into account the environment. But this is more of a philanthropic approach, which can go further. But it is the company's responsibility to go beyond the simple creation of profits. Then we had sustainable development, where the idea was to allow future generations to have the same quality of life as the one that we enjoy currently. And this means we must reduce negative impacts, but not necessarily change our model. Regeneration means changing models. The company model, the governance, as I said, and everything that will help us to go beyond just reducing the negative impact, but to actually have a positive impact, a net positive impact at the economic, ecological, and socio-ecological as well. Because the idea is not to just look at the bottom line, the triple bottom line on economy, social, and environmental, but the social aspect must be, and the economy should be within the social aspect, and social aspect should be within the environment and the ecology, because everything is based on an ecosystemic approach where everything depends upon the living principles, interdependence of all living beings within the ecosystem, among which human beings.
Alors pour faire finir ce tour de table sur la
So to end this round,
Aurélie Bourg, je l'ai dit,
overview of
travailler sur la sécurité énergétique. Donc cette dimension solidaire, on peut la retrouver dans la RSE.
Alors, on devrait
so we should find this in the CSR. As you said quite rightly, for the renewable energy sector, the environmental reflex, is quite natural. But we have some companies that have engaged in processes, regulation helps, but beyond that, there's a voluntary approach to engage in a virtuous process on the environmental level. And I would like to agree with my colleagues, but really on the social side of things. And I really appreciated the fact that you said that the company must also take care of human beings. Yes, we have to look after human beings. A renewable project is always strongly rooted in a territory, so the project must take into account the challenges of this territory and that they don't forget the question of inclusion and the social stakes. We intervene mainly in France, but it's also valid on the international level, because we can have a virtuous impact on the local communities who will train all of the stakeholders around the renewables project. So what we see is that solidarity is not necessarily part of the DNA of renewables sector today. And there is room for progression with regard to this aspect, to encourage all companies to, beyond simple communication, have a real impact locally among the most vulnerable populations. Energy vulnerability is at the heart of Énergie Solidaire's profession, but the idea of being able to bring together the three pillars of the energy transition, which is production of renewables, efficiency and sobriety, can be embodied through the fight against energy vulnerability if renewable energy companies contribute to concretely improving the comfort of life of the very vulnerable populations that live in poorly insulated buildings and which have an energy consumption which is not at all aligned with the objects of decarbonization that we all target in the near future. So the sector must really take on board this aspect. And I would like to say that also locally, within the territories, it's also an aspect that the local elected representatives are very attentive to, and the French authorities, to see how this sharing of value can be achieved locally to the benefit of local authorities, local communities, in order to really achieve a virtuous local dynamics. So now we want to know more about these virtuous dynamics, and we will be seeing some very concrete examples and actions. Myriam, do you have any very concrete actions that go along the lines of what we just said, of the ideal renewable energy company? Well, ideal is a bit idyllic because we have to, put things in a context. It's never ideal, but, which really tries their best. Yes, there are different subjects. For example, there's that of responsible purchases, procurement that comes back very quickly. You're careful about your procurement.
tout est lié aussi à la partie, comme je le rejoins,
everything is
au
linked
niveau environnemental,
to
au niveau
the
sociétal,
environment
par
and
exemple,
social
je prends un
aspects.
cas très concret,
A very
mais,
concrete
je pense que la plupart
case,
d'entre vous le savent,
I'm sure most of
mais
you
il y a
know
des
this,
problématiques
but
de
there
travail
are
forcé sur la chaîne de
problems
valeur
of forced
modules
labor in the chain
avec,
of
du coup,
PV
certaines
production,
mines en
and
Chine
so
qui
certain
extraient du
mines in
polysilicium.
China that
Et du coup, il y a
mine
du travail
polysilicium,
forcé,
and
certaines
there
industries
is
sur
modern
il y a eu en
slavery,
tous les cas des ONG qui ont
and some
démontré
NGOs have
ces
demonstrated
problématiques-là. Donc, le but, c'est
this.
d'essayer de
So
ne
the
pas
idea
de
is
remonter au
to
maximum la chaîne de valeur,
go
de
back
quand on
up
achète
the
des
value
panneaux
chain
PV
as
pour
much as
voir si
possible
le
when we buy PV
polysilicium
panels
ne
to
vient pas
see if the
de là avec ce
polysilicium
travail
doesn't come
forcé-là.
from
Donc,
these mines with this
ça, c'est des
modern
travaux
slavery.
engagés au niveau
So
de
this is
filière.
work that the
Le but,
whole
ce sera
sector is
d'audits
engaged in,
communs
where the
et de
purpose is to
remonter,
do common audits
au maximum jusqu'aux mines
and to
pour
really
éliminer
go
ce genre
up
de
the value
risque
chain
et
to the
pour,
very
voilà,
mines
enfin,
to minimize
faire
that
ressortir
risk.
ce genre de problématiques. Donc là,
And
on parle de problématiques
so we're talking
sociétales,
about social
qui sont quand même assez graves,
issues
du travail
which are
forcé.
very
On
serious
parle
when we're
aussi
talking
de
about modern
problématiques
slavery.
environnementales,
And
donc
we're also
c'est-à-dire,
talking
quand on
about
parle
environmental
d'achat
problems when we're talking
responsable
about responsible
aussi,
procurement.
regarder par exemple
We
le
need to
bilan
look
carbone,
at
le
the
moins
carbon
nocif, pour
footprint.
acheter des turbines, pour acheter
So
des panneaux
when you
solaires,
buy turbines or
d'autres
solar
composants
panels or
aussi,
other
pas que,
components,
ça, il y a aussi tous les composants annexes
there are all of
qui
the
sont des actifs.
and
Donc le but, c'est de regarder
auxiliary
aussi ce
components as
critère-là,
well. So we need to
carbone,
look
qui est
at the
plutôt
carbon
un
criterion, which is
environnemental.
an environmental
Voilà,
criterion.
donc c'est vraiment, il y a ça par exemple, les achats responsables.
So responsible procurement is typically one of the
Ensuite, il y a
important
aussi toute
subjects
la
here.
partie stratégie.
Then there is the
donc là,
climate
on va
strategy,
parler de
where
bilan carbone
we will be
et de
looking at
trajectoire
carbon
climatique. Donc,
results
s'aligner avec
and
l'accord de
climate
Paris pour pas
trajectory.
dépasser,
So
plus
we
1,5
signed the Paris
degré,
Agreement to not go
du coup,
beyond
d'ici
1.5 degrees
2050.
by
Donc là aussi,
2050.
il y a toute une question. Ok, bon, est-ce que les
So the
entreprises ont
question
déjà
is,
calculé leur
well,
bilan
have
carbone?
the companies already
Si oui,
calculated their
du
carbon
coup, elles en sont. Est-ce
footprint?
que c'était juste
If so,
sur
was
des
it
émissions
just
directes, indirectes?
on direct
Ensuite,
emissions or
au bout
indirect
de 2
emissions
ans,
too?
ils ont
And
fait
then
leur
after
exercice
2 years,
consécutif. Ok, maintenant on se pose la
when they've
question de
gone through the
comment
process
réduire ces
again
émissions,
and
sur
they've
quelle
looked at
trajectoire,
how to
avec
reduce
quelle
the emissions,
méthodologie,
with
parce qu'il y en a
which
plusieurs
trajectory and which
aussi. Donc c'est
methodology,
un
because
petit peu
there are a number of
voilà, la
these.
jungle qu'on essaye
So this is the
de
jungle that we're
débroussailler pour voir
trying
quelle est la
to
meilleure méthodologie,
make our way through to
comment
find
faire des
which is
actions
the best
groupées aussi au niveau de la
methodology and how
filière
to
pour
group our
avoir
actions
du
together
poids,
in the sector in order
par
to
exemple sur
carry more
réduire
clout.
aussi
For
l'impact
example,
carbone,
reducing
je sais
the
pas, de l'acier,
impact,
peut-être
carbon
fabriquer
impact.
plutôt des
I'm not from the
matériaux qui
steel
sont
industry, but
recyclés,
maybe we can
de la seconde main.
encourage
Voilà,
the
donc
use of
ça, c'est des
recycled
leviers, en tous les cas, à
materials
mettre en
or
place pour
second-hand
essayer de
materials. So
réduire
these
ces
are all of the
émissions. Alors,
levers
il y a
we
aussi
can
des axes de
action to
sobriété,
reduce
enfin,
emissions.
voilà.
Then there's sobriety as well.
Sur la dépense énergétique ou,
Internally
sur le
looking at
transport,
our
sur la
energy
mobilité.
expenditure or mobility
Voilà,
and
donc ça fait partie
transport.
des sujets. Il y a aussi
So
des questions
these are among the
d'égalité
subjects.
homme-femme.
There's
Ça, c'est un sujet
also
que je voulais,
man-woman
ressortir au niveau
equality,
de
and this is
l'énergie.
something that
Parce
you
qu'aujourd'hui, la
know, we
moyenne au
need
niveau de
to
l'énergie,
look at in
il
the
y a
world of
30%,
energy, because
ça se
on
voit
average,
au salon, c'est ce qu'on
and
s'est
you
dit
can
tout à
see
l'heure
it
en
in
arrivant.
the trade fair
Les
here.
femmes, c'est pas ce qu'il y a en
There
majorité
aren't
dans
that
le
many
monde de
women
l'énergie,
here and in the world of
La moyenne,
energy
c'est à
in
peu près
general. So on
30%
average,
dans le secteur énergétique.
30% women in
Et,
the
dans la
energy
plupart des
sector,
boîtes, c'est
and
quand
most
même,
companies
moins de
it is
30%.
under
Donc,
30%.
comment essayer de
So
faire que
how
cette filière,
can we
attire
ensure
un peu plus de
that
féminin,
this
enfin,
sector
voilà, donc ça,
attracts
c'est
more
des
feminine
questions, un
profiles?
peu plus d'égalité.
So these are
voilà.
questions of equality,
Ça fait partie des sujets sociétaux aussi
and these are part
qui
of the
doivent être
social
travaillés
questions
au
that
niveau
we
de la
need to work
filière
on within the
pour que ce soit un peu
sector,
plus attractif.
so that it is more attractive for women.
Bien sûr, donc c'est très bien. Et Aurélie,
Oh, very
vous parliez tout à
good.
l'heure de l'impact
And
sur le
Aurélie, you were
territoire,
talking
être
to us
soucieux de
earlier
son
on the
impact.
impact of
Ça
the
veut dire aussi
territory.
être soucieux dans ses
And so
recrutements.
it means you
Et là,
have to
on arrive à un
also
sujet
be
qui est
careful
important,
about
c'est
your
les clauses
recruitment.
sociales
This brings
dans,
us to a very
dans les
important
chantiers
question,
qu'on a
that
amenés
is
à
the
réaliser.
social clauses in the work sites that we carry out.
C'est bon, pardon. Donc, du coup, oui, les clauses sociales, effectivement,
So
c'est
yes,
des-
the
c'est des-
social
c'est des axes aussi pour essayer
clauses
de
are
faire de la réinsertion sur les
also
chantiers,
ways in which we can
faire
work on
travailler, du coup, des
reinsertion in the work
partenaires,
sites
du coup,
and
qui favorisent la
work with
réinsertion.
partners
Ça fait
that
partie aussi des
encourage
axes,
reinsertion.
donc il y a des acteurs qui sont
So
déjà
there
bien
are
avancés sur ce sujet.
stakeholders who've
D'autres,
already
qui sont
come
encore un
quite a
peu
long
frileux.
way on that
Mais
subject, and
globalement, le
others who
but,
are
c'est effectivement
a
de
little more
favoriser,
reticent. But the
le
idea
développement,
is to
voilà,
encourage the
on va dire, tout ce
development
qui est,
of
microcosme au niveau du territoire. Et ça peut
territorial
être des leviers aussi pour
microcosms, and
favoriser
these
la
can also be
réinsertion de
levers to
certaines
encourage the
personnes.
reinsertion of certain
Merle,
people.
PIEST, est-ce que vous vous retrouvez un peu? Est-ce que vous retrouvez
So,
AMARENCO dans les
in
exemples que vous
AMARENCO,
venez de
do
présenter?
these speak to the examples
Des
presented, and
exemples
can you you give us some examples of initiatives or regenerative actions?
Avec grand plaisir. Donc,
Yes, with pleasure.
on est toujours en phase avec Myriam.
So, of course, I'm always aligned with Myriam.
Ensemble.
We have worked a lot together.
Donc, comme il y a plusieurs volets. Donc,
so there are a number of things. First of all, for the environment,
nous sommes tous conscients du fait
carbon footprints. We're all aware
chez AMARENCO,
that in AMARENCO, we're at more than 95% of our carbon footprint depends on the value chain. and therefore procurement. So as most PV panels are manufactured in China, there is transport, but also what is used to manufacture the panels.
L'extraction en fait des ressources.
So there's also the mining of raw materials. So there are a number of topics that are biodiversity.
Tout le sol en fait qui est endommagé, mais aussi un grand sujet des droits humains.
Damaging the soil, and then there's the question of human rights, as you said.
Et donc c'est toute la chaîne de valeur.
It's the entire value chain that we are trying to control. So in AMARENCO,
qu'est-ce que c'est la double matérialité?
We're looking at double materiality. What is this? It's the analysis of impacts and risks on the basis of the new European regulations around corporate and social responsibility, where we analyze the impacts of the company on the environment and on society at large. In this framework, we work with our suppliers through the platform called Rachine in order to assess our suppliers. Earlier on, I was talking about the ecosystem. It's an entire ecosystem, so we can't just look at the small scope of the company, but we need to look at the supply chain from the mining of resources, manufacturing, and downstream, the decommissioning of solar plants and recycling. So currently in France we work with Solane, and we achieve 94% of recycling of the materials. That's very good. And we're currently working on that in other countries. So that is carbon. Regarding the trajectory, we are committed to the Science-Based Targets Initiative, the SBTI. And we've committed to reach net zero by 2050. And once again, the commitment with suppliers will be key, because we need to work above all on the panels. What differentiates AMARENCO is our program ECHO to ECHO, which is our regeneration program. The objective is to go beyond just reducing negative impacts and actually have a net positive impact. How do we do this? So we lead soil surveys on site with a partner called Genesis that is recognized in the ecosystems. We look at the quality of soil, the carbon stored in the soil, the water content, so we look at a number of parameters.
Ensuite, après construction, on va pouvoir
vérifier. After construction, we will be able to check what the negative impacts of our installation have been, because of course there are negative impacts. We build things, but we try through regeneration and through the measures we take and the planting of endemic forests, the endemic EOCs, to look at soil cover and the different species that we have, the different seeds we sow. There are a number of points that we work on. So a concrete example before we end. We currently have a project which is on polluted land. And so we will be working with plants to create a mechanism called phytoremediation. And so it's a magic solution. The plants absorb the heavy metals through their roots, and therefore we're on a site where there are a lot of vines, and there's a lot of copper. Copper pollutes soil. And so the plants and the plant roots will extract the copper from the soil, and then we remove the plants, and then we can cover the soil and work on regenerative agriculture. And what about the social side of things? What do you do? Well, for the social side of things, we work with suppliers. We only work with suppliers that have achieved a certain ecological ranking, on CSR ranking. We have colleagues who've just been to China to meet battery suppliers so that we can talk with them, because we also do storage. We have codes of conduct
Ils doivent tous signer le code de conduite qui contient
ask them to sign the code of conduct, which includes local employment, because we go to different countries, but we might. What we want is that the employment be local in the region, so that it benefits the different populations. And then there's also a social side of things among our indicators, and that includes the co-construction with local population through public consultation. But then there are projects where we talk about plants, and we have an educational side of things to explain what regeneration is, because there's a trail that goes through. So all of the walkers, the hikers that go past will be able to understand what regeneration is, and so they understand that the people who build solar farms are not just damaging the environment, but actually trying to regenerate it. Are you familiar with your climate dividend?
Non, parce que Laura, elle pourrait prétendre au dividende climat, Merle avec AMARENCO.
Tout à fait. Mais
voilà.
Ça marche là?
Oui, ça marche très bien. On va parler donc du dividende climat.
So we're going to talk about the climate dividend.
Non, c'est vraiment c'est un vrai sujet.
It's a real subject, and it will be of increasing importance in coming years, because if we calculate our carbon footprint, well, we could also calculate our climate dividend. It might be relevant. So that's the work that you do with your Climate Dividends Association. And you will be telling us how this can fully integrate within a CSR process. That's my first question. No, actually, that was my second. The first is, what is the climate dividend? Because I explained it very briefly, but you can explain it in more detail. Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. So basically, I think that's a very good transition, because when we talk about impact, there are two aspects. This comes back to what Merle was doing on materiality. There are negative impacts that all companies and all human beings have. We're breathing, and we necessarily have a negative impact just through breathing. So, however, there are companies whose activity does have a positive contribution to global decarbonation. So, as Merle said, yes, it is when we create solar panels, it does pollute, because it's not just made from fresh air. But every time we use decarbonated energy through solar panels or other activities, we help the customers, the end users of these solar panels, and to decarbonate, because without these solar panels, they would have used another source of energy, which would no doubt have been far more carbonated, gas or coal, depending on the countries. In France, it's not so much the case, but and so it's not the same thing to spend 1 ton of carbon to manufacture Kit Kats. I have nothing against Kit Kats, but then to create solar panels. So what we try to do is to measure this positive contribution, which is in addition to the negative impact. It doesn't replace or compensate anything, but it measures the positive contribution and changes the approach where we just try to do what we were doing before less badly, but also we look at how we do things well or better. So to have a real shift in mindset. And this brings us back to what we were saying about CSR. So the idea of climate dividends is that it's a measure of this positive climate contribution that we can valorize with regard to the stakeholders. Because today, when you have an economic success as a company, you can distribute financial dividends to your stakeholders, and you and your stakeholders are valorized for that. So everybody knows what a financial dividend is. It's cash, but it's also proof of the creation of economic value. If you don't earn money, you won't be distributing any financial dividends. So it's the same thing, but instead of looking at the economic creation of value, we look at the climate creation of value, these famous emissions that are avoided, the tons of CO2. So climate dividends is the measure of these emissions that we've avoided, that we distribute. So it's 1 ton of CO2 which is avoided or sequestered by the company, which gives rise to 1 climate dividend that we can issue and distribute to the stakeholders. So it's not money, it's the proof of the creation of value, and it allows us to have a standardized standardized and comparable aspect, which in a group such as AMARENCO will help them to know whether to do this project or that project, because we'll have to reliable comparison of the climate interest. Or for a financial investor, should I invest with AMARENCO or somebody else? And I take the example of AMARENCO because they're just here. So it really allows us to standardize this aspect and talk about it. Second element is it allows us to create a far more tangible and valorizable link between this notion of impact and the financial process. Just as a financial dividend, when a company says, I've distributed so many financial dividends, even though you're not a financier and you don't know anything about the company, you know it's a positive economic sign. The idea here is to have a positive climate signal. Doesn't mean you shouldn't check things, but it gives you an initial signal, and then you can integrate it more easily as a financial specialist because it produces the processes you know. So we work on ratios such as turnover versus climate dividend, which is gradually being included in the cycle of financial decisions, and also in the valorization of companies. So it's a bit technical for a Thursday afternoon at 2 p.m. in EnerGaïa, but stick with me, you'll see it's interesting. Today, when we valorize a company, we do it in tangible assets, stocks, turnovers, building, and sometimes we valorize what we call goodwill. This is intangible. It's the brand of a company, which is worth something. You can't buy it as a standalone, but it's worth something. And today, there are an increasing number of people talking about climate goodwill, which would be to say that everything equal, financiers would be ready to pay more for a company that has a positive climate impact. And in the future, I hope a regenerative impact, positive regenerative impact, but step by step. But as we don't know how to quantify that, nobody pays for it. So the idea is the capacity of a company to generate climate dividends or to have a good ratio euro invested or positive climate impact is a way of quantifying this and giving it a value. So that in the future, a company such as AMARENCO, and this is not only applied to renewable energies, but it is quite an emblematic case, in its financial valorization, will also benefit from the creation of climate value. And so therefore, there will be a far more deep-rooted transformation of the model. So which companies have engaged in this process today?
Yes, we're an association that was created by the ADEME with financing and who are experts in carbon. That's only existed since January 2023, so it's quite recent. We've just finished our first years of a pilot phase with more than 30 companies, and what's rather interesting is that it's from a smart startup to a larger enterprise via the infrastructure, small, medium-sized company to renewable energies. We're working this year with Icaros, CDE, and we've got a lot of discussions with larger companies. It's taking a little bit longer, but we're speaking a lot with Voltalia. And what's rather interesting is we worked with the green platform that Myriam's in charge of to develop standards for these measures that allow all of these renewable energy companies to give added value to what they're developing. Earlier, we were talking about the CSRD, the European regulations. Is this part of this? The CSRD now is going to measure the negative elements. We spoke about it, whether it be with carbon or anything else. Unfortunately, today, we are measuring something that's not being taken into consideration by the CSRD, which is an issue. When you take a company, again, like AMARENCO, it's unfortunate if you only look at the negative elements, even though it seems to me like because of their natural activities and all the models, they're doing so much more. It's possible that their carbon footprint is similar to companies that don't do anything for the climate or that are even worse. So we're kind of missing something important. So today, that's not the case, but in the CSRD, you have the possibility to also give added value to certain indicators, like initiatives that are traditional. Some people can do that, but we carry out a job of going to plead for some of these companies with it at the European Union to look at their positive contributions and then, of course, allowing their climate dividends to be integrated within those regulations. At this point, I'd like to ask Aurélie LEREBOURG, regarding everything that's just been said, do you feel from what you're doing, the projects you're leading,
de vos actions là sur EnerGaïa, est-ce que vous avez le sentiment que
le
sujet suscite de plus en plus
subject is of more and more growing interest for the CSR actions and all the tools that have been created? We are situated on the side of what's acceptable projects once they're in development, and we're looking for a landing zone for all of these renewable energy projects. And what we're seeing, in particular in France, and even more particularly in this particular context, it's a little bit difficult to get these projects to be accepted. That what people are saying, it's getting a little bit more difficult in some regions, in some areas, whether it be in urban areas or in rural areas. So we've got to work on this. We've got to work on people accepting these projects and working with the different local stakeholders so that these projects can move forward. If you were to ask the developers today what are the main risk factors and that are also going to interest investors to identify spaces for production, this question of social acceptability is important. So Énergie Solidaire, which is a financing and funding firm, we really want to support companies in giving them the tools and means to work on social acceptability along with local authorities, inhabitants, and associations. And we identified a lever which is fighting against energy vulnerability. So energy vulnerability and people who are vulnerable populations is 15% of all households, which is a large amount. And we're in a phase where the amount of poverty in rural areas, which is very interesting to developers, are simply exploding. We know that more inequality there is in a certain area, more social acceptability for these products or creators of wealth or value can become a true challenge and very, very complicated. What we would suggest today, what we offer to renewable energy companies that want to work with us, is to become, via us, as a guide, tax-free, that they can get a tax rebate if they work with us. We would suggest that they come and support vulnerable populations from energy vulnerability and to work on social acceptability for these projects via social inclusion. In this side of the project, of course, this is very French.
L'ensemble du panel possible pour les entreprises pour se développer.
But we'd like to help the maximum amount of companies to be successful, work and speak with local authorities, think together how to create a virtual dynamic so that the inhabitants, the local population are aware of what's happening so that they want these projects to move forward.
Une acceptabilité sociale qui soit
and that the social acceptability has some weight. In the Occitanie region is supported by the region who has a great desire to move towards renewable energies, and we can see that here today. A program that hopes to work with local populations at the territory level to represent this willpower for the population, for companies, and that's very clear for the inhabitants. Because there's everything that takes place before finding the financing, and then there's everything that's very concrete, very clear, which we've got to explain, and not just in terms of communication or PR, but something that's very clear. If we're planting hedges, we're regenerating soil, we're supporting the most vulnerable in our population and in the most difficult situations. And we have a very virtuous panel of actions that allow us to act on all these different facets for the society and the environment. So we're going to head into the debate, but just one last roundtable in terms of acceptability. One last question. We spoke about it briefly in our introduction. Should we ask ourselves the question, is a good CSR policy, is it a positive lever for acceptability acceptability? Because today we can really see that there's an issue of getting these projects accepted, whether it's a solar farm, wind turbines, etc. And this is a legitimate question. We cannot have this energy transition without asking this question. So yes, of course, we're going to take advantage of this energy, but does anyone really want a solar farm right next to their home? So is there a policy or a CSR policy that could be a positive lever, and under which conditions?
Myriam BEAUPIED, non, pas encore.
Oui, voilà. Je suis un mix des deux, vu que vous travaillez ensemble, vous connaissez bien. Je fais simple, hein. Au plus court.
Je vois qu'il est
I
l'après-midi.
see that it's the afternoon and everyone is starting to be a bit tired, and there will be a replay after.
Je me dis, on a peut-être
And when I'm thinking to myself, we maybe have a few seconds, few minutes.
Au public, donc on parlait d'acceptabilité
When we talk about social acceptability, who among you is starting to feel that there's more and more opposition and hesitancy from the general public when you speak with your local community? Maybe raise your hand.
Donc, il m'en reste un qui est bien convaincu.
So there's one that's convinced,
tous les autres pas
but
encore.
all the others are not.
Mais ça commence bien. Je vais vous proposer
So I would
une deuxième petite
Ask,
expérience.
I want to have another little experiment.
Si on va tous essayer
If we can all
de fermer les yeux.
try to
pour un
close our
petit
eyes
instant.
for just a moment. Please close your eyes. Let's
C'est exactement
meditate.
ça, pour avoir notre approche.
This is another
Donc,
approach.
si on ferme tous les yeux
So everyone close your eyes
et on sent au niveau du cœur
and feel your heart.
et on se dit tous que déjà
And we're all
la
thinking to
terre,
ourselves,
elle est faite de 70%
the land
de
is 70% water.
Le corps humain, il est
The human
également fait
body
de 60%
is
de l'eau.
also 60%
Donc, si on parle
water.
d'écosystème,
So within this ecosystem, we're very
notre corps, il est très
close.
proche de
Our
la terre.
body is very
Et
similar
donc,
to the
si
land.
maintenant on entend bien notre
And now,
cœur,
if you listen to
on
your heart,
inspire,
you breathe
on
in,
expire,
you
et on tourne
expire,
notre
you exhale,
tête sur le côté,
and you push your head to the
d'un
side,
côté et sur l'autre, vraiment,
from one
voilà.
side to the other,
Et on ouvre les yeux
and now you open your eyes,
et on va sourire à son prochain.
and you smile
Si on
at
le
the
voit
person
bien.
sitting next to you, if you can
Non, tout
see
le monde est
them.
réveillé, c'est très bien. Et donc ça comme petite,
This is a
petite passation pour vous
small
dire
exercise just to show you that
l'acceptabilité
social
sociale,
acceptability,
à
in
mon
my
sens, c'est les liens, en
opinion,
fait. C'est la
is all
création
about
de liens.
creating relationships,
d'inclure
creating
toutes les parties
links,
prenantes.
including
C'est de se
include
regarder
all
dans
the
les yeux les uns
stakeholders,
avec
look
les autres.
look into each other's eyes.
On a ces écouteurs,
Unfortunately,
et je me sens
everyone's
très loin de
got
vous,
their
donc ça me
headset
fait
on,
du
so
bien
I
de me
feel really
connecter
far
un peu
away
avec
from
les
you. So
cœurs
it was
pour
really
moi.
nice to have this little experiment to feel closer to
Donc, qu'est-ce que
you.
fait l'acceptabilité sociale
So
du
social
AMARENCO?
acceptability is what we do at AMARENCO.
Faites ça, par exemple. Les réunions de concertation.
Do you have meetings where you all sit and you invite people to
Ça,
close
c'est,
their
c'est une
eyes? And
approche
it's a personal
personnelle,
approach
mais
that
c'est
I have,
aussi
but it's
AMARENCO,
certainly
on
true
aime
that
bien
at
la
AMARENCO
méditation
we
et le
do
yoga.
like
Tout à fait.
meditation and
Mais on a
yoga.
bien les concrets aussi.
But we also
Et,
like
sur le
concrete
concret,
examples
donc,
too.
j'ai plusieurs retours.
I have a lot more feedback from project managers and trying to find out where are they encountering difficulties. Maybe some of you can raise your hand again. Sometimes it's more from a lack of understanding. Some are worried about the noise. It's certainly true that at the time we had ondulators that were very noisy and nobody wanted to hear next to their home, but now that's changed, and so that we've explained that. There's also questions about biodiversity. This is more and more important. The studies have shown us, and we're committed to this at AMARENCO, and we work on positive biodiversity, so we really try to improve biodiversity, so it's important that that be explained as well. And because of this lack of understanding, in particular in regions where it's more complicated in the south, where there's a lot of PV farms, we have project managers that are really making efforts to knock on doors and ask neighbors to speak with them, because if it's only during public survey and we're getting letters from associations or different organizations that are entirely opposed to these projects, that will not help the project, and it's not the time to discuss. So we've got to discuss it with them right from the start, and this approach is interesting because a lot of people are fearful. People are afraid to be criticized, but we've got to move past that.
faut trouver une solution pour
We've got to find the solution so that we can all work together. And beyond social acceptability, just to finish, we must go further in regeneration. It's beyond social impact is to create a positive impact. It's internally in companies and external. Internally, because what can we do? Our employees, that's really important. Our employees, they're doing the work. Up to now, we're asking them to go even more faster, so it's even more stress, more pressure. So you've got to keep that in mind. At AMARENCO, we created a working group, a task force of regeneration. So I work with some volunteers from the company on how to, a thought process of changing the business model of the company to become a regenerative company so that it's not uniquely or not only internally used or applied to projects, but applied to the corporate side of things. And there's also a benefit for the employees so that they have good work conditions. And externally, the social impact is the local community. We've spoken about it, and that's essential. And I'm going to stop there because I could just talk about this forever. And I'm sure there are other questions, and I'll happily answer them. Myriam, on this question of acceptability, yes or no, can CSR be a positive lever? Yes, I think depending on the question, when we speak with developers, it's the same questions that come up again and again on the shelf life of the park, etc. When we reassure people that, and we can explain to them, we've taken into account, we have a long-term vision of all these subjects, everything's well structured, and we explain exactly what we plan to do, this is where it becomes reassuring and a strength for the company who's trying to develop itself. And we, kind of gain some points, let's say, in terms of acceptability on this point. Thank you. Maybe two small questions, and you can react to this on the climate dividends. How can we gain awareness when we're a CSR company? Can I just jump back to what Merle said, because it was interesting. When we created climate dividends, as I said, it was to measure the positive impact and give it value with the funders. But we had some feedback from many companies, which we didn't anticipate, which was on the commitment of the teams and the employees. They were quite happy that this CSR approach was here to give added value to what they were doing correctly and not just, tap them on the fingers and say, this is what you're doing better. It's better to look at what we can do better and not what we can do less worse. So, of course, if you're decarbonating, you're doing better. But what was really interesting to be to see how proud people were of this, and they were very pleased to say that we have a company that's saying we want to have more impact, we want to be positive, but are really aligning these strategic criteria and it's not just PR, blah, blah communication. It was serious. It could be also serious as in terms of the payroll and bonuses. So this was really important to employees, even in, we also work in the building and construction sector. So for a lot of these people, CSR isn't necessarily something important, but they were very proud to see their values align with what they're doing. And I think that side of things, aligning what's happening externally and internally. We do it really well for some of the projects we're carrying out, but sometimes it's a disaster for companies whose employees are in burnout. Okay, I'm exaggerating. I'm from Marseille. In French, we say the Marseille like to exaggerate, but I think that's interesting. And I can answer the second question. Today we have, we talked about renewable energy companies. If they want to start this approach, they need to come see us. Notre cadre méthodologique use our methodology to measure their carbon footprints. It's kind of like a calculator that really makes it easier for you to do this. Adhere to the methodology, which is shared by many, many stakeholders, and then we accompany them throughout this process to verify it, also mutualized with auditors from CSRD or elsewhere. And then in terms of the climate dividends, we give it value via via the stakeholders, with the banks, funders, and so that becomes very interesting for companies. So if anyone is interested, I'm very pleased to discuss it with you, or you can just send us a message via the website, which unfortunately is only in English because we really work a lot internationally. Thank you. So we would love it if any of you would like to ask a question or have comments. Just raise your hand, and there's a microphone somewhere going around the room, or maybe this gentleman already has it if he wants to use it. Yes, I do have a microphone, but I don't have any questions.
Ça s'appelle être désigné volontaire.
C'est ça. Hop, on lance le micro et hop, à toi la question. Alors,
je pouvais juste en profiter.
Maybe I'll just take advantage.
Non, mais sinon vous lancez le débat à quelqu'un d'autre.
Talking about the difficulty that developers have in the field in terms of social acceptability. Number of solutions that have been developed or spoken about here by the could be helpful to move forward in our projects and better understand the challenges linked to these projects. Thank you. Who else would like to react?
Interagir avec
or interact with our speakers.
Qui ont une belle énergie.
Great, a lot of energy, luckily.
Alors, est-ce que nous avons des questions,
Do we have any questions?
de remonter un témoignage, de
or
partager une expérience?
anyone who wants to share an experience? If not, she has a question for the room.
Non mais peut-être que nous on sait pas trop.
Maybe
on s'est présenté, mais on sait pas.
We introduced ourselves, but in the room we don't know who we're speaking to. Are you? Who's a developer? For example, raise your hand.
D'accord.
Okay.
À moitié, ok. Qui est peut-être
Who is a producer?
D'équipement,
for example, equipment,
Qui êtes-vous?
parts and pieces. Who are you?
Des fournisseurs.
Suppliers?
Ok. Qui sont les autres gens?
Des étudiants?
Students?
Non, non plus. Je sais pas, par exemple, au premier rang,
So
qui sont les dames?
who are you at the front row here? Let's ask.
Pardon.
She's actually wearing her company jacket. Hello, Bérangère Aurora from Arcolia. We produce green energy via turbines, agricultural PV, and metallization.
Tu avais une question, Laura?
You had a question, Laura.
Vu qu'elles ont le micro.
Très bien. Ma question, ça peut être ça. C'est est-ce que vous, aujourd'hui, chez Arcolia, c'est ça? Est-ce que vous avez des démarches RSE
do you have CSR approaches that have been defined? And do you measure your emissions? And is this something that you like to do, something that you're looking to do? Yes, well, we're part of the ADEM platform. We work with Myriam and Merle very regularly on all different sorts of subjects, many of the things you spoke about today for CSR. I was also in contact with you for climate dividends because it had been presented to us by Myriam in one of our meetings. And we're following up on this closely using the calculator. We're going to try to look at our first avoided emissions, so we're very committed to this. That's fantastic. I didn't know, but that's great.
Merci beaucoup à toutes.
Thank you, everyone. We can warmly. One last question, because it's nice to interact with the audience. If you want to represent CSR as of today at EnerGaïa, it's possible because we launched a solidarity challenge. It's kind of like a telethon.
Ça parle bien sûr. En proposant en fait à tous les exposants et les visiteurs du salon
visitors and participants in this conference to contribute concretely to energy vulnerability in the region. And it's not on the screen, but as soon as we change slides, you will see how you can participate. There's a QR code. So rendezvous Hall B2 67, stand 67. You can make a donation. It's the end of the year. It's a tax-free donation, so please do. And that will certainly be very generous and allow you to start your commitment to the social acceptability of companies.
On va vous l'apporter alors. Merle?
Par contre, on est en train de faire la pub.
So if we're doing advertising, I'm going to add to that. At AMARENCO, we also have crowdfunding in order to adhere and gain more social engagement, social commitment. If you're interested, not just developers, but anyone else in the room, you can go see the AMARENCO stand or website, and you can see and hear more about our different projects. And Myriam?
Je suis pas bonne pour ça.
No, I'm not good at that, so I'm going to...
Bonjour.
Oui, bonjour.
Hello.
Gladys Leclerc de
Gladys Leclerc from LCL. We work on renewable energy. We finance them, but also on the PPA side of things. We help our purchasers and our ETI clients to supply themselves with green energy via a multi-actor PPA. My question is about CSR in a broader sense, and notably for climate dividends. I'm struggling to see the difference between climate dividends and subjects of compensation or contribution. I know there are also labels and certificates for low carbon via the ADEM or for compensation or contribution. I would just like to understand the difference. There are two tools that are very complementary in what we call compensation. Those are the carbon credits in the broadest sense of the term. But it's pretty different. I'm going to try to make this as simple as I can. I don't think you're stupid. I just want to make it as simple as possible. So most companies need to have investors in their capital to move forward and produce solutions and sell it. When the solution, I'm going to continue speaking about the KitKat. When it's not a KitKat but a PV solar panel or renewable energy, beyond just making money, when you sell this solution, you're avoiding certain emissions, and so you have a positive impact. So for the company, they can say, I made this much money and I had this much impact. What, bravo, let's applaud them. Now, if you want to retranscribe that into equity for your investors, for the financial element, you've got the financial dividend, which is cash, but it's also the proof of the creation of value. But on climate, you have nothing. And this is where you've got the climate dividend. This schema that I just described to you that seems rather simple is valid whether it's if you're selling a solar panel of renewable energy directly or if you're selling a carbon credit. Because a carbon credit is simply, and I'm not saying it's bad, but at its base, it's a financial benefit that allows you to make your impact more clearly and make your business plan more secure. It's your marketing plan. Do you sell your energy directly or are you selling carbon credits? You can sell a carbon credit because it's interesting in terms of regulations, but despite the strategy that you decide to implement and the sales, let's say, you can say, I've made this much money, I've had this much impact. And if you want to share this with the investors, you need to talk about this in terms of climate. They're complementary, and the measure that's done for this impact is the same. We recognize a certain number of methods of low carbon from the ADEM, not all of the carbon credits, because not all of the approaches are legitimate, but the method ideally is the same and they're complementary. And the second point that's interesting to understand this well is that a carbon credit, it's first made for projects that aren't viable on their own financially. To include a carbon credit, to be able to sell carbon credits to another company, you've got to be able to prove that you've got financial additions. In essence, that you're struggling financially to be able to do this. Historically, this was done for forestation, renewal of ecosystems, who were not meant to become cash machines. So this is a measure in terms of you create value for the climate, whether you're having trouble financially or not. Here's another, not necessarily renewable energy, but another example. We work with Decathlon producing bikes because they help people to decarbonate their mobility. Decathlon has no trouble to sell bikes. They certainly don't need me to sell a bicycle. However, I prefer that they are selling bicycles rather than thermal vehicles. They're creating climatic value and they're helping the entire population for decarbonization. So the scope of projects and activities that are eligible to the climate dividend is much wider than a carbon credit. And last small point, and then I'll stop, but because this is a key subject and very, very interesting, carbon compensation has a logic that we kind of want to go beyond. doing something wrong on one, and then we buy carbon credits to compensate these poor actions. What we would like to say is if you're doing something wrong, and everyone's doing something wrong, but we want to minimize that, but we can also do something positive, and we can also positively contribute, and we don't necessarily have to compensate it. It doesn't need to be reduced. There's many ways to positively contribute. It can be buying carbon credits for a project. It can be public speaking about it, or it can be investing capital in a company that contributes to decarbonization, and then we can have dividends. So it's a complementary tool within the scope of all of this type of logic. Sorry, that was rather long, but I hope it was clear. Thank you. I think we've said everything we had to say. There are no more questions. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. Let's applaud our speakers. Thank you for this wonderful time spent together. Thank you.